By the end of the 19th century, the United States was becoming wealthy at a speed even it did not yet fully understand. Steel railroads cut across the continent like new arteries of the nation. Factories roared day and night. Industrial families rose with a velocity that had taken Europe centuries to achieve. And yet, there was one thing American money, no matter how abundant, could not fully buy: legitimate social status. Not wealth alone, but recognition, the feeling of being accepted, of being considered refined, of entering the same psychological and cultural space long occupied by the old aristocracies of the Atlantic world. It was within that void that Marble House was born. Not as a home, not as a summer retreat. Marble House was conceived as a declaration in stone, a structure designed to answer a question that quietly haunted America's upper class during the Gilded Age: could new money replace old blood? The answer, at least in form, was carved from more than 500,000 cubic feet of marble imported from Europe. The woman behind that declaration was Alva Vanderbilt, one of the most powerful figures in American high society, despite owning no factories, railroads, or banks of her own. In a world where men controlled wealth and women were expected merely to represent it, Alva turned social space into her personal battlefield. She understood that in the social order of the late 19th century, architecture did not merely reflect power, it created it. Her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, provided access to virtually unlimited financial resources. But Vanderbilt money, immense as it was still considered new. It lacked history. It lacked lineage. And it lacked the instinctive deference that European aristocracy extended to itself through generations of inherited status. Marble House was created to fill that absence. Completed in 1892, the building made no attempt to hide its ambition. Its facade drew directly from French Beaux Arts architecture, with Corinthian columns, symmetrical vaults, and a layout more reminiscent of royal palaces than a seaside summer residence. The interior was not merely extravagant, it was intentional. Every room was designed as a social stage, where ritual, attire, posture, speech, and visibility were all meticulously calculated. Within those gilded halls, Alva Vanderbilt did more than host parties. She constructed order: who was invited and who was not, who stood close to the hostess and who remained at a distance, who was deemed worthy of crossing the heavy marble thresholds. But beneath the splendor, a quiet paradox began to grow. Marble House, built to assert status, exposed an uncomfortable truth: status cannot be fully purchased with money. It requires the recognition of others, and that recognition is never entirely under the control of the newly wealthy. The more they tried to prove their belonging to the aristocratic world, the more clearly they revealed that they still stood outside it. Marble House, with a cost equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today, was not the end of the race for status. It was merely a higher rung in an increasingly fierce social competition in Newport, where the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and other industrial dynasties erected summer palaces like pieces on a chessboard of prestige. And within that very competition, personal fractures began to appear. The marriage between Alva and William Vanderbilt, once a powerful alliance, gradually became a strained structure trapped within its own marble walls. Marble House did not merely consume money, it consumed emotional energy, social expectation, and personal freedom. A house designed for flawless display was unforgiving toward the very human vulnerabilities that existed inside it. And this was only the beginning. Because Marble House, though created to assert position, ultimately became a symbol of a far larger question facing Gilded Age America. When a society allows money to buy everything, is there anything left that cannot be priced? That question would continue to haunt these marble walls for decades to come as marriages collapsed, power shifted hands, and the meaning of luxury itself was re-evaluated by history with a colder, more distant eye. When Marble House was completed and its first grand receptions illuminated the gilded halls, American high society believed it was witnessing a decisive victory of wealth over history. Yet within the very spaces designed to project perfection, private tensions began to accumulate at a pace no architect could have anticipated. A house built to assert control became an echo chamber, amplifying every fracture between two individuals confined by social roles they no longer governed. For Alva Vanderbilt, Marble House was not merely the product of ambition, but proof of her unrivaled command of social power in a world structured by men. For William Kissam Vanderbilt, it increasingly resembled a symbol of depletion, not only of wealth, but of privacy and personal autonomy. In rooms engineered for public ritual, there was little space left for human fragility to exist without scrutiny. In the late 19th century, divorce among America's elite was never a private matter. It was a social rupture. Wealthy families constructed their legitimacy on outward stability, and any visible crack threatened the entire structure. For this reason, when Alva chose to end her marriage, the act was far more than personal. It was a challenge to a social order that quietly protected men and punished women who stepped outside their prescribed roles. The divorce of 1895 sent shockwaves through Newport, not because of the Vanderbilt fortune, but because of what the separation revealed. Alva did not retreat into silence. She demanded custody of her daughter. She secured financial independence. And most importantly, she retained control of the social terrain she had built. Marble House, rather than becoming a monument to marital failure, transformed into a symbol of a woman redefining power within America's upper class. Society's response was swift and unforgiving. Whispers moved through parlors and ballrooms where women were expected to embody restraint, while men rarely faced accountability. Yet what unsettled Newport most was not the divorce itself, but the fact that Alva was not exiled. She continued to host major events. She continued to decide who crossed the marble threshold. She retained a form of influence that money alone could not secure. Marble House now carried a different meaning, no longer merely an extravagant birthday gift from a wealthy husband. It became a sovereign social domain controlled by a woman who understood the mechanics of prestige. In a culture where power often hid behind ritual, Alva used ritual to rewrite the rules. Guest lists became instruments of diplomacy. Evenings became negotiations. Architecture became the stage on which gender roles were quietly renegotiated. Yet this victory came with a psychological cost. Marble House demanded constant presence, relentless perfection, and a social rhythm that pushed inner life to the margins. Within halls filled with music and laughter, solitude could exist unnoticed. A house built to prove belonging now raised a deeper question: could social dominance ever replace personal peace? The divorce did not weaken Marble House. It sharpened its symbolic edge. From this moment on, the mansion no longer told only a story of wealth-seeking legitimacy. It told a story about the price of defying order. It stood as a fixed stage where triumph and loss were inseparable, and where history began to examine luxury not as aspiration, but as burden. And as Alva turned her gaze beyond Newport, her ambition evolved with it. Marble House had fulfilled its role in one chapter of her life. The next would move beyond American society and into a realm where legitimacy was not performed, but inherited, a world of titles, bloodlines, and alliances that would demand an even higher price. After the shock of her divorce, Alva Vanderbilt did not withdraw from the social stage, nor did she seek the quiet disappearance society often demanded of women who crossed its boundaries. Instead, she entered a new phase with striking clarity. If marriage had once been a gilded enclosure, it would now become a diplomatic instrument. Alva had learned that within the world of prestige, personal alliances could function like political treaties negotiated, leveraged, and deployed with strategic precision. Her remarriage to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont was not a romantic retreat. It was a calculated realignment. Belmont belonged to an older financial lineage, one that carried a deeper sense of inherited legitimacy in American high society. Through this union, Alva gained what Marble House alone could not fully provide social validation from the most conservative guardians of elite status. The marriage was received with a mixture of caution and fascination, as Newport quietly questioned whether this was reconciliation between two social powers, or another deliberate maneuver by a woman who had already proven herself disruptive. During this period, Marble House ceased to function as a battleground of private conflict and became a point of convergence for influence. The gatherings held within its walls grew less ostentatious, but more deliberate. Conversations shifted away from fashion and display toward broader themes: America's cultural identity, its relationship with Europe, and the emerging question of women's roles beyond ornamental visibility. The marble interiors, once designed to overwhelm, now served as a controlled backdrop for ideas that quietly challenged the order that had produced them. It was in this context that the Chinese tea house was constructed on the Marble House grounds. This addition was not an aesthetic novelty. It was a deliberate signal. By introducing an East Asian architectural form into the heart of Newport's elite landscape, Alva expanded the visual language of power beyond Europe. The structure communicated a subtle assertion: cultural authority did not have to be inherited, it could be curated, redirected, and redefined. As Marble House evolved, so did Alva's public identity. She began to use the estate as a platform, not merely for social consolidation, but for ideas that extended into civic life. Meetings and conversations increasingly touched on women's suffrage, political representation, and the limits of democratic inclusion. A mansion born from personal ambition gradually assumed a political function unofficial, yet undeniable. The marriage to Belmont brought stability in appearance, but not simplicity. Two formidable personalities occupied a space already heavy with symbolism. Marble House, in this new role, continued to reveal its central paradox: the greater the public authority it enabled, the narrower the space left for private life. Moments of quiet became rare, and when they appeared, they underscored the isolation that could persist even amid grandeur. Yet this chapter marked a decisive shift. Alva was no longer seeking acceptance. She was redefining legitimacy itself. Marble House ceased to be merely a monument to industrial wealth aspiring toward aristocracy. It became evidence that social power could be repurposed, redirected toward goals that extended beyond the individual. But this transformation carried its own cost. A structure designed to serve ambition could not fully escape the burdens embedded in its foundations. As the Gilded Age began to recede and America moved toward a period of reflection, Marble House would once again be forced to confront a changing world, one that would examine its splendor with increasing distance, and its meaning with colder precision. As the 20th century began, the rhythm of American life started to change. Symbols that had once represented personal success and economic dominance were increasingly placed under public scrutiny by a society beginning to question what it was becoming. Within that shifting landscape, Marble House entered a new phase, no longer merely a stage for elite ritual, but a space where public debate quietly began to challenge the old order. At the center of this transformation stood Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. Having secured her social position through marriage and influence, she chose not the safe path of preserving the image she had constructed. Instead, she pushed Marble House into more dangerous territory, transforming it into a platform for the women's suffrage movement. This was not a sudden gesture. It was the result of a long realization that social power, if not converted into political influence, remained ultimately performative. Meetings advocating women's voting rights were now held within grounds once reserved for gilded receptions. The contrast was deliberate. Alva understood the power of setting. Discussions of democracy unfolding inside a mansion long associated with exclusion forced society to confront its own contradictions. Marble House became a test case for a larger national question: could democracy tolerate voices long denied access to its most powerful spaces? Reactions among Newport's elite were divided. Some viewed this shift as a betrayal of the social order that had elevated them. Others watched in silence, sensing that the world was changing in ways that could no longer be controlled. Marble House, built to reinforce social boundaries, was now opening them not by dismantling the structure, but by repurposing it. This transformation carried a personal cost. Alva's public image, already controversial, became inseparable from political confrontation. Marble House, a place that had never permitted privacy, once again magnified every decision. But this time, the exposure served a broader aim. The mansion became a vessel for a national conversation not official, not institutional, yet impossible to ignore. In this role, Marble House revealed one of the deepest paradoxes in American history. Spaces created through concentrated wealth were now being used to challenge the inequalities that produced them. Luxury, once defined as the opposite of equality, was compelled to serve arguments for inclusion. This contradiction gave Marble House a significance far beyond architecture. Yet the transformation did not erase the past. It layered over it. Beneath speeches and reformist gatherings remained the memory of lavish banquets, strategic marriages, and social domination. Marble House did not choose a single identity. It accumulated them. And it was precisely this accumulation that made the building increasingly difficult to judge by simple moral categories. As the suffrage movement expanded beyond Newport and moved closer to historic success, Marble House's active role began to recede. It had fulfilled a purpose no original blueprint could have anticipated, acting as a bridge between excess and reform. But with that fulfillment came a new and unsettling question. Once political goals were achieved, what remained for a structure born of personal ambition, yet consumed by public life? That question would guide Marble House into its next chapter, as the Gilded Age faded and America began to re-examine its monuments of wealth with a colder, more critical eye. As political victories came into view and the women's suffrage movement moved closer to historic success, Marble House began to enter a quieter state, not through sudden collapse, but through the slow withdrawal of living power. The grand halls that had once hosted ritual, spectacle, and reform grew less central, not because the house lost meaning, but because its role had been fulfilled within a changing social order. This transition did not occur at Marble House alone. It unfolded across Newport and the seasonal capitals of America's elite. The Gilded Age, sustained by unchecked accumulation and the belief that display itself proved progress, began to erode under new economic and political realities. Federal income taxation, antitrust reforms, and shifting public attitudes toward wealth rendered vast private estates increasingly difficult to justify financially and symbolically. Within this context, Marble House moved away from active authority and into another domain: memory. It no longer determined who belonged, nor did it serve as a launch point for public movements. Instead, it began to exist as evidence, a material record of ambitions that had already passed. For Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, this period marked a gradual withdrawal from Newport's social center. She had accomplished more than most women of her era, shaping elite society, defying marital convention, and contributing to national political change. Marble House, in that relationship, was no longer a necessary instrument. It became legacy. And like all legacies, it raised an unavoidable question. How would it be understood once its creator no longer directed the narrative? The transfer of ownership and function at Marble House mirrored a broader American shift. These mansions had been built for a specific way of life: long summer seasons, extensive domestic staff, and relentless social performance. In a new century, that model no longer fit. The houses became burdens, yet also repositories of cultural memory, physical archives of an era the nation was not ready to relive, but not prepared to erase. When Marble House was opened to the public and placed under preservation, its meaning shifted once again. Rooms once private became exhibition spaces. Stories once tightly controlled were retold by historians, guides, and archival records. Authority passed from individuals to collective memory. And in that process, Luxury was detached from its original function and transformed into an object of interpretation. Preservation did not neutralize the house. It intensified its contradictions. Each new layer of interpretation sharpened the same enduring tensions: wealth and equality, private power and public responsibility, aesthetic admiration and ethical reckoning. As a museum, Marble House offered no final judgment. It invited visitors into a space where awe and unease could coexist. By this stage, Marble House was no longer socially alive, but it was far from dead. It had moved from present power into historical consciousness without disappearing, and it was precisely this transition that made it one of the most complex symbols of the Gilded Age, not only because of what it had been, but because of the questions it continued to pose to those who walked its halls. When Marble House fully entered public life as a preserved historic site, it did not simply change ownership, it changed the way it was seen. What had once been a space that decided who could enter and who would be excluded now became a place where admission could be purchased. Power once attached to closed doors was replaced by visiting hours, interpretive panels, and carefully designed tour routes. History, in this new form, was no longer something lived within, but something experienced under controlled conditions. This transformation reflected a broader shift in how modern societies engage with the past. The great mansions of the Gilded Age were not demolished, they were preserved, cleaned, and presented as material evidence of a vanished era. Marble House, with its polished marble and symmetrical halls, became a place where visitors were permitted both admiration and reflection. Yet between those two responses lay an unresolved tension. Did preservation soften the injustices that had produced the building, or merely repackage them? Within the exhibition spaces, the story of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was often told with deliberate balance, acknowledging both ambition and reform. She appeared as a social architect of elite life, and as a figure who redirected that power toward political change. But placing this narrative within a guided experience also meant enclosing it, smoothing its sharpest edges to make it legible and acceptable to a broad public. As a cultural destination, Marble House entered a new economy, the economy of memory. In this economy, the past no longer threatens the present, it inspires it, educates it, and at times decorates it. Luxury, once a mechanism of exclusion, becomes an aesthetic style. And this aestheticization raises an uneasy question: are we learning from history, or consuming it? Yet, Marble House never entirely surrendered its capacity to unsettle. For visitors who lingered, who paused over architectural details, construction costs, and the social context that surrounded them, initial admiration could give way to discomfort. The marble walls told not only a story of taste, but of concentrated wealth, of a society that once believed spectacle itself was proof of progress. In those moments, Marble House reclaimed its role as an open question rather than a finished exhibit. This role became even clearer when Marble House was viewed alongside the other Newport mansions, forming a collective memory of the Gilded Age. The repetition of excess did not dilute the narrative, it reinforced it. Marble House was not an exception, but part of a system of visual language through which wealth sought legitimacy and permanence. Standing at the intersection of preservation and performance, Marble House exists as a testament to how history is reused according to the needs of each generation. It no longer commands, and it no longer excludes. But it is not harmless. It invites visitors to admire and, if they choose, to question the hidden costs beneath the beauty. And it is in this simultaneous ability to please and to disturb that Marble House continues to live not as power, but as dialogue. At this final stage of its journey, Marble House no longer needed new roles to justify its existence. It stood where it had always stood, enduring time with quiet indifference, like a marble mirror in which America was compelled to see itself. The grand halls fell silent, once filled with ritual, debate, and ambition, now amplifying a single unresolved question: what can money truly buy and what can it never secure? Within the broader sweep of American history, Marble House exposes a central contradiction of the American dream. On one hand, it testifies to the belief that individual success can overcome origin, that ambition and accumulation can propel one beyond inherited limits. On the other, its very presence reveals a deeper anxiety, the fear that new wealth, no matter how vast, still lacks the cultural and psychological legitimacy of older societies. The figure of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont lingers not as a protagonist, but as a trace, her choices using luxury to conquer society, then redirecting that power toward reform, are no longer judged as victories or failures. They exist as evidence of an individual grappling with a system larger than herself. Marble House, shaped by those choices, became both instrument and constraint. As a symbol, the house reveals the limits of display. Every column, every gilded surface speaks of a belief that magnificence could stabilize social order. But as time stripped away urgency, that belief was exposed as fragile. Order cannot be maintained by spectacle alone. Legitimacy cannot survive without collective consent. In its preserved stillness, Marble House neither condemns nor defends the era that produced it. It stands as proof that America once sought to borrow the language of European aristocracy to define itself, and that this borrowing, however successful in form, never resolved the underlying question of identity. The marble does not answer what America is. It only reminds us that the question was once carved into stone. Visitors who leave Marble House do not necessarily depart with admiration or criticism, but with an unsettled awareness. They have stood before a beauty constructed from extraordinary resources, yet burdened by expectations it could never fulfill. In that sense, Marble House becomes a long metaphor. Every society builds symbols to reassure itself and must eventually confront the questions those symbols cannot answer. In the silence of the present, Marble House speaks more clearly than it ever did in its years of spectacle. It no longer seeks validation. It simply remains asking those who look upon it to consider what their own era is building, and why. When the final layer of narration falls silent, Marble House remains exactly where it has always stood, without seeking a conclusion or offering justification. Atlantic winds continue to move across its marble steps. Late afternoon light still settles on its Corinthian columns along familiar paths. Nothing in its presence suggests that an era once placed such immense expectations upon it. And it is precisely this calm persistence that deepens the story rather than diminishes it. History is often told as a sequence of climaxes: construction, display, collapse. But buildings do not follow narrative rhythm. They do not end when human power withdraws. They accumulate time. They layer meaning. Marble House does not summarize the Gilded Age. It preserves it with all of its contradictions, ambitions, and unresolved anxieties intact. What remains is not the cost figures or the guest lists, but the sensation of a society that once believed form could stabilize essence. Marble House was built to create certainty in a world changing too quickly: certainty of status, of belonging, of meaning. But when those certainties dissolved, the structure endured, quietly reminding us that stone may last but belief does not. As a historic site, Marble House does not compel admiration or condemnation. It creates pause. That pause allows visitors to recognize how symbols of power, once stripped of function, become unusually honest mirrors. They reflect how societies once allocated value, legitimized inequality, and trusted beauty to substitute for moral consensus. From the vantage point of the present, Marble House no longer belongs to a family or a movement. It belongs to a long question within American history: how to reconcile personal aspiration with collective responsibility, and how to remember a luxurious past without allowing it to obscure the costs that made it possible. The house does not answer. It simply remains long enough to ensure the question is not forgotten. Perhaps that is Marble House's most enduring role. Not power, not reform, but presence, a presence that slows the viewer, inviting careful attention and an acknowledgement that every era leaves behind structures that speak for beliefs once considered unspeakable. In the silence of marble, history does not freeze. It continues its work. When Marble House is placed within the broader landscape of Newport and the Gilded Age, it no longer appears as a singular story, but as part of a repeating pattern. It did not stand alone. It belonged to a sequence of mansions built according to the same logic, using architecture as a language to compensate for the absence of inherited tradition, using space to soothe anxieties about legitimacy. Within this pattern, each estate attempted to surpass the last larger, costlier, more refined. The competition was not merely between families, but between ideas of who possessed the right to represent the pinnacle of American society. Marble House was once a bold declaration, but it soon became a reference point for declarations even grander. In this escalation lies a central paradox of new wealth. When there is no symbolic endpoint, ambition must continually raise its own stakes until display itself becomes evidence of insecurity. Comparing Marble House with its contemporaries reveals a striking consistency. Nearly all borrowed the architectural language of Europe, France, Italy, sometimes England, as if American identity required validation through the reflection of the old world. Yet the more faithfully these forms were replicated, the more clearly they revealed an uncomfortable truth: imitation rarely brings the comfort of origin. The closer the copy, the stronger the reminder that the tradition being performed does not truly belong to its performer. Marble House thus illuminates the reality that the competition of the Gilded Age was not only economic, but symbolic. It was a struggle over who had the authority to define taste, refinement, and worthiness. Within this struggle, women such as Alva Vanderbilt Belmont wielded a distinctive kind of power. They controlled ritual, aesthetics, and social choreography, the elements through which power became visible and accepted. Marble House was perfectly suited to this function, even as it bound its users to an unrelenting demand for perfection. When the Gilded Age receded, this pattern did not disappear. It transformed. Marble palaces were no longer built at the same scale, but the logic of using wealth to purchase legitimacy persisted, re-emerging in new forms, new spaces, and new cultural institutions. Viewed this way, Marble House is not a relic of a dead past, but an early map of a social behavior that remains familiar. What distinguishes Marble House is not that it was larger or more beautiful than others, but that it lived through enough roles to expose the pattern completely. As a wedding gift, a social stage, a political platform, and finally a preserved monument, each phase revealed another limitation of using form to resolve deeper questions of identity and power. In every phase, the house succeeded by immediate standards and failed to provide lasting reassurance. Looking back, Marble House offers an unsettling lesson. Every society constructs symbols to legitimize its order, and must eventually confront the questions those symbols leave unanswered. The Gilded Age chose marble, gold, and ritual. Later eras choose different materials and languages, but the cycle: aspiration, display, doubt, and reevaluation continues. Within that cycle, Marble House occupies a singular place. It no longer needs evidence to persuade. Its presence alone is sufficient to suggest a recognition. Money can construct space, but it cannot by itself construct enduring meaning. Meaning emerges only when societies are willing to confront the costs beneath their symbols and accept that not every ambition can be resolved in stone and gold. When a story reaches the point where no further evidence is required, Marble House emerges not as a climax, but as a conclusion without words. It does not end in collapse, nor in triumph. It ends in the way great structures often do, by outlasting the intentions that created them. The marble remains luminous. The axes remain precise, yet the power once attached to them has withdrawn, leaving space for history to enter. Within that space, Marble House confronts America with a quiet paradox. A society founded on the promise that anyone could rise repeatedly constructed symbols meant to soothe its anxieties about legitimacy. Marble, gold, and ritual were mobilized to declare that new wealth deserved old respect. But over time, those symbols revealed their limits. They could astonish, but they could not secure lasting agreement. The presence of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont lingers here, not as a force of command, but as an imprint. Her choices converting luxury into social authority, then redirecting that authority toward political reform, remain embedded in the house's memory. Marble House stands as both the product of personal ambition and evidence that power can be reshaped without ever escaping its original constraints. At this stage, the house no longer belongs to new money or to old lineage. It belongs to a longer lesson, a lesson that every attempt to resolve questions of identity through form alone is temporary. As contexts change, form becomes document, then artifact, then silence a surface upon which later generations project their own questions. If Marble House proves anything through its endurance, it is this: history does not require drama to carry weight. It requires time. Time enough for once obvious choices to become strange, and for buildings meant to reassure fear to become evidence of that fear itself. In the stillness of marble, America does not find answers, it encounters the depth of the question. And perhaps that is the only fitting ending. Not a verdict, not a celebration, but a full stop, a pause in which the viewer departs with the understanding that the hidden cost of luxury lies not in its price, but in the expectations societies place upon stone, money, and status, things never meant to bear the meaning of a national dream. When the final image fades, Marble House remains not as a subject awaiting judgment, but as a space that has learned how to endure silence. Its marble steps no longer lead toward living power. They lead into memory. And within that memory, history does not ask to be loved or condemned. It simply exists, complete and unyielding. There is a persistent illusion that history must be resolved, that every grand narrative demands a moral verdict. Marble House resists that illusion. It demonstrates that meaning does not reside in conclusions, but in the capacity of a question to survive. This building has endured ambition, social ritual, political reform, and finally aesthetic remembrance. Each era attempted to define it. None succeeded in fully owning it. The presence of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont in this epilogue is no longer that of a commanding figure or a reformer at the center of events. She appears instead as a human trace, someone who worked with the tools available to her: wealth, space, and ceremony to reach beyond the boundaries imposed upon her. History does not simplify her choices. It places them in long view, where achievement and limitation coexist without cancellation. Marble House thus becomes a quiet lesson in the durability of material and the fragility of status. Stone can endure across generations. Legitimacy cannot. It must be recognized, negotiated, and sometimes denied. What was built to soothe anxiety about belonging ultimately became the place where that anxiety is most clearly visible. As a historic site, Marble House does not instruct us on what to think about the past. It reminds us that the past does not disappear once it is framed. It continues to operate through interpretation, exhibition, and the simple act of walking through space shaped by earlier values. Every step across its marble floors is a silent participation in a dialogue between what was constructed and what was never fully resolved. This epilogue does not elevate Marble House into a final symbol, nor reduce it to an object of blame. It leaves the house where it belongs as a marker of a moment when America attempted to use form to substitute for identity, and when history, with the patience of time, answered that no material is strong enough to carry a collective dream without reflection. And when the screen goes dark, what remains is not Marble House itself, but the silence it leaves behind, a silence long enough for the viewer to ask in our own time, what are we building? And what do we hope those structures will speak for us? Once our voices have gone quiet, there comes a moment in the life of every historic structure when it fully detaches from the intentions that created it. Not through destruction, but through time. At that moment, Marble House no longer belongs to those who imagined it, nor to those who once controlled it. It enters a wider, current the way societies remember, select, and reinterpret their past. Marble House was built to answer a very specific anxiety that new wealth required an old language in order to be accepted. But once that language had been spoken, once the generation that needed it stepped aside, what remained was not validation, but evidence. Evidence of a period in which society believed that form could substitute for moral foundation, that splendor could resolve unresolved tensions. As heritage, Marble House no longer participates in the arguments of the Gilded Age. It occupies a different position, one of comparison. Later generations enter its rooms carrying new questions about inequality, about soft power, about who gets to shape collective memory. These questions do not diminish the house, they reactivate it. Each new framework of interpretation reveals a layer of meaning earlier generations either could not see or chose not to confront. This is what makes Marble House an uncomfortable but necessary legacy. It does not allow the visitor to simply admire. It demands questioning about the relationship between beauty and cost, between symbolic authority and social responsibility. In the stillness of its halls, one begins to understand that legacy is not a reward. It is an obligation, the obligation to remember honestly, even when memory unsettles comforting myths. Seen beyond Newport, Marble House becomes part of a global pattern, spaces born from economic power that later transform into sites of cultural reckoning. In that pattern, history does not soften the present. It sharpens it, reminding us that yesterday's choices always leave structures for today. Marble House is no longer the story of a family or a movement. It is the story of how societies grant authority to symbols and how, over time, those symbols demand answers in return. If there is a conclusion to this chapter, it lies in the shift from ownership to shared responsibility. Marble House does not belong to the wealthy, to preservationists, or to storytellers. It belongs to an ongoing process through which a society learns to face the structures that once upheld it. In that process, heritage ceases to be a source of pride alone. It becomes a reminder that cannot be ignored. And when visitors depart, carrying images of marble and light, what remains is not uncritical admiration, but a heightened awareness that what is built to endure will eventually be required to confront questions even more enduring than itself. As the 21st century unfolds, Marble House no longer faces the question of what it once was, but the more difficult question of what it is now used for. In an era when inequality has returned to the center of public debate, structures born of concentrated wealth cannot exist as neutral scenery. They become sites where memory, ethics, and interpretation converge, places where the present must negotiate with the past rather than merely display it. In this century, Marble House is entered with smartphones, audio guides, and curated pathways designed for a global audience. Access is more democratic than ever, yet it introduces a new paradox. When everyone can enter, meaning risks becoming thinner. The halls that once commanded silence through power now often fall quiet through familiarity. Aesthetic awe coexists with the rapid consumption of experience. Yet it is precisely within this context that Marble House gains a renewed capacity to speak. Placed alongside contemporary conversations about wealth, privilege, and inheritance, marble ceases to be merely a material. It becomes metaphor. Each stone recalls how wealth was once concentrated, how that concentration was justified, and how those questions never disappeared, they only changed vocabulary. In the 21st century, Marble House no longer represents new money seeking old status. It represents the memory of a historical moment when America believed it could borrow the past to stabilize the present. What gives the house its continuing weight is that we now face similar choices, though expressed through different forms. The symbols of power may no longer be marble, but the logic behind them remains familiar, the construction of form to create legitimacy. Marble House thus becomes a powerful reflective instrument. It allows the present to see itself at a safe historical distance. When visitors ask about construction costs, labor, exclusion, and access, they are also asking indirectly about the structures of their own time. The house does not answer on their behalf. It keeps the question open. And it is precisely this openness that prevents heritage from becoming inert. In the accelerated rhythm of modern life, Marble House functions as a slowing force, a place where time is briefly decelerated. And within that deceleration, one may recognize that stories of power, anxiety, and aspiration do not belong to a single century. They merely change setting. Marble is no longer raised in the same way, but the symbolic materials of the present continue to perform similar work. When the 21st century looks back at Marble House, it does not find a final judgment. It finds a delayed mirror, one that allows self-recognition without immediate defense. And it is this capacity to place the present beside the past without simplification that ensures Marble House remains relevant long after its living power has withdrawn. When every explanation has been spoken and every context placed where it belongs, Marble House remains without demanding a verdict. It seeks neither forgiveness nor praise. In the pale morning light along the Atlantic coast, the marble does what stone has always done. It exists, quietly and without negotiation. At this point, history is no longer a sequence of events to be arranged, but a state of awareness. Marble House does not repeat its story. It allows silence to complete what words cannot. Within that silence, the viewer understands that symbols of power do not disappear when power withdraws. They enter another life, the life of memory, where meaning is no longer imposed, but slowly renegotiated across generations. The presence of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont here is no longer that of a commanding figure or a reformer at center stage. She becomes one layer among many, embedded in time. Ambition, reform, contradiction, and limitation coexist without erasing one another. History does not refine people to fit moral lessons. It preserves complexity, because complexity is the truest record. Seen from sufficient distance, Marble House is no longer a story about wealth or poverty, right or wrong. It is a story about the anxiety of societies in transition. When old orders can no longer guarantee stability, people turn to form architecture, ritual, symbolism to repair a sense of certainty. But form, no matter how magnificent, can only postpone the question. It cannot replace it. And when the generation that built the structure steps away, when the rituals that once filled its halls dissolve, what remains is not an answer, but the capacity for reflection. Marble House does not instruct us what to think about money or status. It offers a space durable enough for those questions to survive time. In a modern world driven by speed and immediacy, the endurance of marble becomes an unexpected reminder of the value of pause. If this story has a final meaning, it is not spoken aloud. It lies in the moment the viewer leaves the house, turning away from columns and light, carrying a quiet realization. Every era builds its own marble houses, not always of stone, but always of forms expected to speak on behalf of power, value, and belonging. As the screen fades to black, Marble House does not close history. It opens a space in which the viewer must ask what they themselves trust to endure, and what they hope will still speak when human voices have gone silent. In that space, marble offers no answers. And for that very reason, it endures. After the silence settles, after the questions have been asked and left unanswered, one truth remains quietly intact: Marble House was never the destination. It was a passage, a structure through which ambition passed, through which power experimented with form, and through which history learned what permanence truly means. What endures is not the marble itself, but the lesson embedded within it. Marble House reminds us that wealth has always sought vocabulary ways to explain itself, justify itself, and inscribe itself into time. In the Gilded Age, that vocabulary was stone, symmetry, and imported tradition. Today, it may take other forms, but the impulse remains the same: to make power visible, and therefore believable. Yet visibility is not the same as legitimacy. Marble House demonstrates this with uncommon clarity. It stood flawless in appearance even as its purpose shifted, fractured, and dissolved. It remained impressive long after it ceased to command. In doing so, it exposed a fundamental limit: structures can endure physically, but meaning must be continuously renewed or it fades. This is why Marble House matters beyond its era. It does not belong solely to the 19th century, nor to the families who financed it, nor even to the movements that later occupied its halls. It belongs to the recurring human attempt to anchor identity in form. And it belongs to the quiet realization that no form can permanently hold what societies ask of it. There is a temptation, when standing before such a building, to believe that we are more enlightened now that we see what earlier generations could not. But Marble House resists that comfort. It asks something more difficult, not whether we judge the past correctly, but whether we recognize ourselves within it. Because every age builds its own marble houses. They may not be carved from stone. They may be digital, financial, cultural, or symbolic. But they serve the same purpose, to suggest stability where uncertainty persists, to suggest meaning where consensus is fragile. And like Marble House, they too will one day outlast the intentions that created them. In this sense, Marble House is not a relic. It is a rehearsal, a preview of what happens when ambition hardens into architecture, when wealth seeks memory, and when time is allowed to speak back. As the final image lingers, what the viewer carries away is not admiration or condemnation, but awareness. Awareness that permanence is not achieved by building higher, heavier, or more beautifully, but by understanding the limits of what building can do. Marble House stands because stone is patient. History stands because memory is selective. Meaning stands only when questioned, and so the story does not truly end here. It transfers, from marble to mind, from structure to reflection, from a house on the Atlantic coast to whatever forms our own era chooses to trust. That is what endures after marble.